Hello, everyone. My name is Jay Crossan, and I'm a senior researcher with Mathematica Policy Research, and I want to thank you for attending today's webinar, Supporting Leaders to Promote Quality and Patient Safety, How Practice Facilitators Can Work with Practice Leadership to Support a Culture of Safety and Quality. Before we begin, I want to cover a few housekeeping items. Alex, could you turn to the next slide? At the bottom of your audience console are multiple application widgets you can use. If you have any questions during the webcast, you can click on the Q&A widget at the bottom and submit your question. We'll try to answer these questions during the webcast, but if a fuller answer is needed or we run out of time, we'll answer it later via email. We do capture all of your questions and we will try to get to them, so please keep them coming throughout the presentation. A copy of today's slide deck and additional materials are available in the resource list widget that looks like a green folder at the bottom of your screen. You can expand your slide area by clicking on the Maximize icon on the top right of the slide area or by dragging the bottom right corner of the slide area. If you have any technical difficulty, please click on the Help widget. It has a question mark icon and covers common technical issues. You can also submit technical questions using the Q&A widget. An on-demand version of the webcast will be available approximately 1 day after this webcast and can be accessed using the same audience link that was sent to you earlier. Now I'd like to introduce Bob McNellis, Senior Advisor for Primary Care at AHRQ. Bob, you now have the floor.
Great. Thank you, Jay. Appreciate that. Hi, everyone. It's great to be with all of you today. As Jay mentioned, I'm Bob McNellis. I'm Senior Advisor for Primary Care at the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality. And it's my pleasure to welcome you and thank you for joining us on this webinar today. This is the third in a series of 5 webinars to introduce you to our coming soon Practice Facilitation Model Curriculum. In the first webinar, we set the stage by highlighting 3 exemplary practice facilitation training programs that have influenced our thinking. Back in October, we provided a sneak preview of modules around electronic health records and HIT. This month, we'll provide some insights on how several modules might be applied to achieve specific goals. In this case, we're talking about a goal that is a high priority at AHRQ, and that is making care safer by advancing patient safety. But before I go there, let me do what I've done at the start of all of the webinars, and that is introduce you to our program. First, I'll talk a bit about AHRQ's interest in practice facilitation, why we think it's so important. Then I'll acknowledge the experts who've guided this work, followed by a brief review of the agenda for the webinar. Finally, and hopefully quickly, I'll turn it over to our facilitators and special guests for today's lively discussion. So next slide, please, Alex. AHRQ's mission is to produce evidence to make healthcare safer, higher quality, more accessible, equitable, and affordable. We also partner with others to make sure the evidence is understood and used. Consistent with that mission is AHRQ's belief that primary care is the foundation for a healthcare system that delivers safe, high quality, accessible, equitable, and affordable care. We recognize that primary care is under pressure from many forces today. So we've invested in research to help understand the best approaches to support primary care practices as they transition from older models of care to newer models of care that emphasize better patient outcomes, better experiences of care for patients and clinicians, and help lower costs. It's clear that many primary care practices, especially smaller practices, need outside expertise, what we call an external infrastructure, to support them as they work through transformation and efforts to improve quality. We see practice facilitation as one important evidence-based strategy to assist practices as they move to new models like the patient-centered medical home. And practice facilitation can assist with the ongoing quality improvement efforts needed to make these substantive changes. Let me put in a quick plug, of course, for our website, AHRQ. We have white papers, briefs, and other resources on all of these issues on our PCMH Resource Center, and you can see the link there at pcmh.ahrq.gov. Now, patient safety, as I alluded to earlier, is one of AHRQ's top 4 priorities. In many ways, our work to improve patient safety is what people know best about AHRQ. Whether it's AHRQ's program to decrease healthcare-associated infections, the comprehensive unit-based safety program known as CUSP, our patient safety tools and measures, our support of patient safety organizations, and even our program around team steps. Safety is our bread and butter. I also need to give you a plug that you can find resources on all of our patient safety materials on AHRQ's websites. But we also know that too little attention has been paid to safety issues in the ambulatory environment, including primary care. And although we do have some great resources for practices, including the medical office survey on patient safety culture and a companion set of tools and resources for practices, we know that because of the time pressures primary care is under, it may be up to the practice facilitators to bring this information to the practice. Also, it's more than just handing practices a collection of resources. It will really be up to practice facilitators to work closely with practice leaders to assess the practice culture and, if necessary, help promote a culture of safety. I noted that I think our timing today is particularly good because culture was noted as the #1 word of the year by Merriam-Webster, I thought. So we're particularly timely. Our hope today is to at least provide some hints as to how practice facilitators can make this happen. And we'll feature information that you'll be able to find in our new practice facilitation curriculum. Next slide, please, Alex. So about that curriculum, let me just say a few words about it. It's being developed by AHRQ and the team at Mathematica to support education and training of primary care practice facilitators. This new curriculum builds on our current practice facilitation handbook created by Lindy Knox at LA-NET and Cindy Brock here at AHRQ. We're adding new modules and enhancing existing ones, linking them with our competencies development, creating an instructor's guide with suggestions about assessment, and building a wealth of student and instructor resources, in addition, and providing additional information about how to deliver the curriculum through various modalities. You can expect to see the final curriculum early next year. Next slide, please, Alex. All of this, of course, would not be possible without the team at Mathematica and LA-NET and our technical expert panel. It's an impressive group of experts, and on behalf of AHRQ, I want to acknowledge them and thank them for their time and contributions. Next slide, please, Alex. On today's program, here you see our agenda for the next 80 minutes or so. We're almost done with bullet number 1, so then we can get on to the much more interesting discussions. Next slide, Alex. Here are the folks you're going to hear from today. Together, they represent a significant amount of expertise on the topic of working with practice leadership to promote culture change and nurturing an environment which supports quality and safety. And with that overview, I'll turn it back over to you, Jay, to get the ball rolling.
All right, thanks, Bob. So to set the stage for the rest of our presentation and conversation here, we will define practice facilitators as specially trained individuals who work with primary care practices to make meaningful changes designed to improve patients' outcomes. They help physicians and improvement teams develop the skills they need to adapt clinical evidence to the specific circumstance of their practice environment. And with that definition in mind, I'll turn it over to Lindy to get talking about today's content. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Jay and Bob. And the first thing I want to do is encourage the audience to please, as you have questions, post your questions, because we will be having an open Q&A session right after our speakers have shared their thoughts. And so we would like you to submit as many questions as possible. It makes for a much better discussion afterwards. So the first thing, Alex, if you could forward the slide, please. I'd like to do is kind of build a little bit on what Bob said about this curriculum. We're very excited about it. We think it's going to be a great resource for really anybody across the country interested in doing this kind of work. And I just wanted to tantalize you with a few topics, a few of the modules that we're preparing. We have one that we're working on that is around a strengths-based approach to quality improvement that can help especially in practices that maybe are defensive, where people feel like performance data is a criticism rather than an aspiration. And Russell Cole from TransferMed, from our TEP, has worked with our team closely on helping to improve that content and get it ready for the modules, for the curriculum. We have another one that's looking at root cause analysis. So when you get your performance data, then what do you do? Just because you know you're underperforming in an area, then how do you go about fixing that? And root cause analysis really helps you dig into the causes for that particular performance or outcome. And we worked very closely with another one of our TEP teams, Melinda Davis, LJ Fagnan's team out of Oregon, to develop some of that content. We have another module that's helping practices learn to run effective meetings. And I think this is a particularly exciting one. And I believe that Tony Suchman will talk about that a little bit today, is how do you use meetings to change culture and really create buy-in across an organization for quality and improvement. Something so simple as the way that you structure and run a meeting can make a huge difference in a way a practice functions. And Jennifer Powell from our TEP worked closely with us, as well as Tony Suchman, on that particular module. We have another one on using EHRs to support the patient-centered medical home, and actually our last webinar really featured that one. And that's really been a collective effort of Ann Lefebvre's team in North Carolina, Allison Gottsman, and some of her facilitators from Health Teamworks, some of the folks from the LA High Tech Rec, run by Mary Franz and Mary Mitchell. And then we have another module, and you can see there's many others. I'm just highlighting a few, that's optimizing teams. And this one's very exciting because it really builds on the work of Tom Bodenheimer and his team on these high-performing practices and some of the lessons learned from the LEAP study that the McCall Institute has also been very pivotal in. So Alex, next slide, please. So with that kind of teaser there, and hoping that you guys will get excited and interested in using these materials, I'd like to just do a slightly deeper dive into the module we're highlighting on today's webinar. And this one is really around working with and supporting practice leaders. And in our own work out here in LA Net, it's been a struggle for me to figure out how to prepare my practice facilitators to engage leadership effectively. Oftentimes they're intimidated. Maybe they don't feel quite comfortable reaching out to leadership. There's also issues around not wanting to jump the hierarchy and jump ranks. Understanding, where leaders are coming from, practice leaders. Really thinking here, there's several levels that we're working with. Some are what we call the C-suite, or the chiefs across a multi-site organization. So the chief medical officer, the chief operating officer, the CEO. And then there's the site-based leaders. And so really, how do our facilitators understand what the motivations are of the different leadership within a practice? And then how do they, Alex, if you could go ahead and jump to the next slide, please. How do they effectively work with them? And so this module introduces, it's really designed for facilitators that are new to the field, not for someone that's had extensive experience already working out in practices, although even that particular audience will probably benefit from some of the content. But really those folks that are just getting to know the primary care environment, helping them understand the different types of leadership structures. How does a federally qualified health center look different from, say, a small privately owned practice that may actually be a family-run business? What does leadership look like in those types of practices where you may also have dual relationships, where husband and wife may be working together, or people from their neighborhood? And how does a facilitator work within those different structures? A second part of that module is really tips, and then these are kind of from our TEP and from practice facilitators out working in the field, is what are some things that have worked well for them in engaging leadership? And then next slide, Alex. And then the final piece is really introducing the facilitators in this module to some tools that they can use to be useful to and help leaders, very practically useful. One of the things that we've learned over and over again is that the support our facilitators provide must build capacity, and it must be immediately useful to the practice, or they tend to turn you off pretty quickly. And so there's some wonderful material in there around leading complex change, the difference between adaptive challenges and technical challenges, which I think Tony may also touch on in his talk. There's some tools for changing practice culture. So how do you shift from a culture where if you make a mistake you feel like you're in trouble, or you feel like you may want to try to hide that, versus one that's really a learning organization, and the exploration of performance is really involves curiosity and aspiration, and how do we get better? So there's some tools there around using, again, meetings, doing effective relationship delegations, techniques for improving communication. Alan Edelman from Pennsylvania has shared a process he used called dialogic leadership that really can help leaders communicate more effectively with their teams. And so we equip the practice facilitators both with some training in this, but also a way to connect the practice to deeper resources if they want to learn more in that area. And then finally, teaching the practice facilitators to ask good reflective questions that kind of give that leadership and those leaders a chance to kind of step back, pause during the crush of a busy work week or day, and think slightly differently about change and improvement in their organization. So next slide, please. So with that, just brief kind of dip into that leadership module, which I think is just really coming together extremely well, and I'm very excited about, and I hope will be useful to our audience. But now I would like to shift to our first speaker, Dr. Tony Suchman. And Dr. Suchman, or Tony, is an organizational consultant and clinical professor of medicine from the University of Rochester School of Medicine and Dentistry. He has a wonderful intervention and consulting program that he does working with upper-level leadership called Relationship-Centered Care. And Tony and I met actually with some work that we were doing for the VA system out here in Los Angeles. And so, and I think he just does fantastic work in really helping leaders kind of overcome some of the ways they may sabotage change in their organizations and really support teams and introduction of a quality of improvement and safety in their organization. So with that, I'd like to turn the floor over to Tony. And Tony, I'd like to start really with a first question for you, and ask you to tell us a little bit about your work with leaders in healthcare organizations, and maybe qualify a little bit what the level of leadership is you're working with. And then some of your lessons learned in helping them become more effective at leading quality improvement and kind of this introduction of a culture of safety in their practices.
Great. Thanks, Lindy, and welcome, everybody. Whether you referred to this as a talk, I hope it'll be much more of a conversation. I think we do.
Absolutely, Tony.
Than just a talk. But do you all remember the book, Everything I Ever Learned, I Learned in Kindergarten? I think if I were to write a book like that, it would be Everything I Ever Learned, I Learned by Studying Patient-Clinician Communication. So I started out as a health services researcher, and I was really interested in how patients and clinicians talk to each other, and medical interviewing and shared decision making, and that really micro one-on-one level. Then you bring the family in, but it's sort of that most basic unit of communication, and learned about what does partnership look like in terms of the kinds of things that you say and do from 1 second to the next and 1 minute to the next. At the most micro structure of human interaction, what does that look like? What are the skills? What's the kind of mindset? Is that teachable, or are you just born with it? You know, when I was in medical school, I don't think anyone ever watched me interview a patient. And I think there was this attitude, you were born with good bedside manner or you weren't. And if you were, good for you, lucky for your patients. If not, oh well, nothing you can do about that. And I've had the privilege in my career over these 30 years to see that really shift, so that, sure, there's natural changes in ability, but wherever people are, they can shift and they can move. And so in looking at those communication behaviors in the patient-clinician domain, I started getting interested in what's the organizational environment in which they're working, and how does that help or inhibit what's going on. And it's a moment that my friend Diane calls a duh-ha moment. It's kind of a cross between aha and duh. It's like the way people are being treated, the way the staff are being treated, is going to have everything to do with how they're going to turn around and treat patients. So if we really want patient-centered care, we want patients to be respected as humans with their own unique stories, and to be engaged as active partners in their care, the staff has to be treated the same way. Yet, crazily, in this age of HCAPs and pay for performance, you can find plenty of places where they're beating the staff into being nicer to patients, or you're having a mandatory workshop on how to engage patients as partners. Just all these kinds of things where there's a mismatch in the process. So in the work that I've been doing with managers and management at all different levels, the story has been parallel process. Think about what you want to be happening on the front lines, the kind of experience that you want patients and their family members to be having. And then look backstage and say, to what extent are we doing that everywhere, whether the patients and families are there or not? So this work has been with CEOs and senior leadership teams. It's been within service lines and service line leaders, or on clinical teams like cardiac surgery teams. It's sort of with primary care groups that are trying to make the transition to medical homes or different stages of the medical home, working with the growing number of internal consultants within healthcare organizations. A growing number are starting to have their own organizational development staff. So working with different people at that level. But I think the core of this work is just to become mindful of what are we doing, just to kind of wake up from the trance. We tend to act in a certain way that's always been done. The way we've treated, we just take it for granted, never even stop to question it. So we sort of notice, how are we treating each other in this moment, and are we treating each other the way we want to see patients and family members be treated? And if not, let's take a time out. No harm, no foul. Let's take a time out. Let's talk about it. Let's figure out why not, and then figure out a different way to do it. So it's really about starting an epidemic of reflection, of noticing what values are we enacting in each moment, of noticing what's the culture that we're creating in each moment, how are we treating each other, and making that something that is open for discussion instead of something that everybody just automatically and mindlessly continues and replicates without even realizing that they're doing it.
Tony, could I interject just a minute? Because I love this idea that you're talking about. I call it an internally consistent organization. We do a lot of this same work with our promotoras of trying to manage them in the same way and support them in the same way we want them to support the community they're working with. Can you give me some specific examples of how you've gone about creating this epidemic of reflection? What tools do you use or processes? How do you help leadership and clinicians and staff in an organization start, just how would I begin that at one of my practices?
One of my favorite examples and one of my earliest experiences with a large whole organization change was the medical school at Indiana University in Indianapolis and at 9 other centers all around the state. They were adopting a competency-based curriculum, and one of the competencies was professionalism. And they were thinking, how do we teach professionalism? You don't have a lecture about it. You might have a kind of a workshop session where students do some reflection and journaling and personal conversation like that, but even that probably wouldn't be enough. What really influences professionalism is the organizational culture. It's what students see enacted around them, the way they're treated and the way they see other people treating each other day after day after day. So the culture of this whole huge organization, that is the curriculum in professionalism. So he said, if we want the students to be acquiring this, to be integrating this notion of professionalism, we have to be working on our culture. So we kind of advertised for a group of volunteers, of people who are interested in working on this. And one of the first things we did was an appreciative inquiry. So this team came up with a set of questions, and they went out and interviewed maybe 100 different people all around the campus, students, faculty, staff, patients, lots of different people. And they were asking for moments when the culture was at its best, when the way people were treating each other represented the highest ideals of how they wanted students to learn how to treat patients, whether students were there or not, whether patients were there or not, just when those values were being expressed. And we gathered those stories, and then we went around giving some talks and workshops and dialogues based on presenting back the themes from those stories and encouraging people to tell more. And as people heard that, they say, oh, I want to get involved in this project too. It's like it was a beacon that called people. And so we had a kind of coaching session for anyone who wanted to be involved, or a series of monthly coaching sessions for anyone who wanted to be a culture change agent. And we also went around to lots of different committees and work groups and teams and invited them to notice to what degree does the way they do their work, say it's the Academic Standards Committee or the Admissions Committee or whatever, to what extent does the way they do their work embody the way they want their students to learn to treat patients. And sometimes when they did that, there were these moments of horror. There was one group, I think it was the Academic Standards Committee, that would review student course evaluations. And when a course was evaluated poorly, they would send a letter to that faculty member. It was a form letter, and their name for that letter was the ding letter. You're getting dinged. So they recoiled in horror and said, oh my God, look at what we're doing here. We have to stop that immediately. And they designed a much more partner-like, collaborative, engaging process where a member from the committee would go and sit down with that person, talk with them about their goals, review the feedback, and then think with them about how they could improve that course. So that just that notion of reflecting on process, and there was kind of an epidemic of that reflection. More and more people went around and did that. The admissions committee changed its criteria for admitting students and how they did their interviews. It was just a snowball of changes as people got engaged and empowered. So we started out with the idea of changing the culture, and really, as two consultants, we could not go out there and tell everybody what to do. That would have been inappropriate, and it would have died. Instead, we wanted to engage them in figuring out for themselves, put some tools in their hands that they could use to design it. And I have to say, we had very strong support from the dean, from Craig Brader, who at the time, who was very much about increasing the research budget and biomedicine and all those kinds of things, but he also very much valued this issue of culture. So he actually invited us to meet every month for 3 years, every month, with his executive dean team, he and his executive associate deans, so that they could reflect on the relational dimensions of the work that they were doing and how their work was contributing to the culture. We even at one point were discussing, how do you do a layoff in a relationship-centered way? How do you do a layoff in a way that's still respecting the quality of relationship and respect that people are experiencing? Sounds like an oxymoron, but it actually was very, very powerful.
And Tony, this is great. And so this type of work that you're doing at a fairly large institution, tell me how would that work in a small practice or in a like a 3-site federally qualified health center? I guess I'm wondering if I went into the leaders and said, gee, we're going to do this process and look at how you all are functioning, I'm thinking I might run into some resistance.
Well, it's the same thing but easier, because you could actually get everybody in the room, or a sizable proportion of people in the room at once. But it's the same thing about offering a vision and then helping people figure out kind of designing that vision together. And then as they're ready for it, presenting tools or choices or methods that they might use that they might not know. I mean, there is a role for the practice facilitators to have some expertise, to have some expert knowledge, but you don't start with that. Here's what you need to do. It's like getting people engaged in creating their own vision. It's their own creation of that vision that creates their commitment to it. And then in service of that, you could introduce ideas. What do you think about this? What do you think about that? That sort of thing. But I've done appreciative inquiries on much smaller scales. It's a wonderful storytelling approach. I'll refer people to the module that you mentioned. It's very narrative. It's about storytelling. It's about the relationship building of telling and hearing each other's stories, of synthesizing knowledge from those stories, and the fact that it's grounded in success. It's grounded in competence. It's grounded in things that we've achieved. We know how to do this. It's not wistful, if only we could do that, but it'll never happen. It's based on, it's principles that are based on, we've actually done this. So it's building people's sense of confidence and competence.
So, Tony, if we had now done this in a practice, and I'm thinking about my own practice facilitators, are there booster sessions? How do you sustain it over time? Because it sounds like that one example you gave, you came back for 3 years. If you're building this capacity in an organization and trying in one of our practices, would we need to keep coming back, or is it something that you can kind of build within and help them sustain it themselves?
I think it depends on how long it takes to build the capacity in the practice. The practice needs to sustain itself ultimately, or it's not going to work. And so that may involve some coaching for the leaders, that if there's an internal consultant or an internal practice facilitator helping to develop their skills and provide them continuing support for what they're doing. I think eventually this relationship-centeredness, this attention to interpersonal process, how people are treating each other, gets hardwired in. One way of doing that is pretty early in the process, inviting the organization or the group or the team at whatever level of scale to develop their own touchstones or operating principles or behavioral standards or whatever. It's the expectations of what do we need from each other, how are we going to treat each other. And it typically says things about respect and about open-mindedness and about speaking your mind, not kind of thinking something but holding it back, not talking to each other behind your backs, that sort of thing, open communication. But again, it really means a lot for the group to create its own standards as opposed to just have somebody impose it top down, because that's already enacting the old culture when you impose anything top down, and you can't use the old culture to get to the new one. You have to really be living and modeling the new culture to get to the new one. So if people create those behavioral standards and they get some coaching and some help in saying, how are we going to really use them? We know we're all human. We're going to step out of line from time to time. So when one of these standards is breached, how are we going to talk about it? And how are we going to deal with that? Not by hitting that person over the head or making them feel bad or shaming them or whatever, but just pointing it out and kind of calling them back, pulling them back, helping them get back on course. It's really hard to live up to these standards all the time, so we need to help each other be excellent. But if you don't say anything about it for fear of confronting someone, then those standards don't really mean anything. So it's creating those standards and helping people figure out how they're actually going to use them. That's one thing. Another thing is designing meetings, the meeting practices you were referring to before, that create that. So if people check in at the beginning of the meeting, instead of getting right down to work, typically you feel like you've got so much to do, you just want to get right to the work. But if you take a moment to say, how are you doing? How's everybody doing? Is there anything happening that might be keeping your attention outside of the room, even though your body is here, your mind isn't? That just by saying it, maybe that'll help you set it aside, and then you can focus. And at least we'll know how to calibrate your behavior. Like if you're frowning while I'm talking, but I know that you're frowning and looking at your watch because you're worried about whether the roofer is showing up to fix that hole from the tree that fell, then I won't say you're frowning and looking at your watch because you don't agree with what I'm saying or something like that. So we can get to just a few minutes at the beginning to check in, to calibrate with each other, to get to know each other, helps the work go much more efficiently. Other things during the meeting, like nominal group process. Let's just take a moment at this point in the conversation. Go around, hear what each person is thinking. And you can pass if you want to. This is not share or die. At the end of a meeting, an appreciative debriefing. Say, let's go around and give each person a chance to notice, to call out something that somebody else did during the meeting that you found really helpful or really engaging. That's Psych 101. That's positive reinforcement, but it's a way to help, which increases the likelihood that that behavior is going to happen again in the future. But it also is getting people used to noticing their group process and talking about it. Not in a very threatening way, just a very interesting way, just simple way. Just point out the things that people said during the meeting that you found helpful or engaging. So in those as you start to make those regular practices, then the culture gets stronger and stronger and starts to sustain itself. And a new person who's joining the group, joining the practice, participates in those, sees everybody else acting that way, they'll sort of pick up that pattern too. And without even having to sit down and teach them, they will start to develop better process skills and a better relational process. And particularly if the guidelines or the touchstones are there and people are really using them, and without making a big deal of it, helping each other be accountable to them.
That's great, Tony. So last question, and we have probably about 3 minutes maybe to address it, and I know it's a really big question, but can you connect this for our audience to safety? So I know that's one of the things that we're wanting to touch on in this particular webinar, and how these things you're talking about also promote patient safety. And I've actually had the good fortune of hearing you talk on this, and it was a pretty compelling discussion. I'd like you to share just a little bit of that if you could with the audience.
Sure. Okay, 3 minutes. I better wind up really tight.
I'm sorry.
That's all right. This is all about safety. First, Deming, he says, drive fear out of the organization, drive fear out of the workplace. So people have to be safe enough to talk about an issue or a concern they have, whether it's a concern about a process generically or a concern about what we're doing to this patient right now. You're about to install that thing backwards, or, what about this drug interaction or whatever. People have to be willing to speak up. So the culture is completely about safety. But even more to the point of safety, there's a term I've been using a lot lately, this term of interdependence. We want people to work autonomously. We don't want everyone to just sit around and wait to be told what to do. We want them to make decisions for themselves. But we need everybody to be making decisions for themselves with the mindfulness of how their work is fitting into that larger whole, how what I do affects your ability to do your work and vice versa. And we have to be able to have conversations about that. So my friend and collaborator, Jody Hoffer-Gattal at Brandeis University, has come up with this really great theory called relational coordination, which describes sort of 7 dimensions of how people are working together that makes this interdependence possible. And then that interdependence in turn is correlated in all kinds of research with outcomes, including safety metrics. And it really is about the degree to which people on the team are each thinking from a whole point of view, seeing how their work fits into a larger whole, as opposed to just thinking about getting their own piece done without regard to the rest of it. And the extent to which they understand the work that everybody else is doing, and so they know who needs to know what when, and that they respect the work that everybody else is doing. So this is about this culture of interdependence, of the kind of people managing the space between them, managing the interaction between themselves as they're each doing their specialized work that contributes to this larger whole of patient care. And that, again, that correlates very strongly with patient safety.
Fantastic, Tony. Well, thank you so much. And we'll have some opportunities to ask you questions after the other 2 speakers. And again, I want to encourage the audience to please submit your questions for Tony and for our other speakers through the system so we can address them in a little bit. And Tony, I was very struck also with, as you were talking, that we're really talking about a profoundly patient-centered organization when you're talking about creating these same kinds of mirror connections among staff and clinicians as you do and want them to create with their patients.
We have to be doing it backstage or it will never happen up front to anybody.
Absolutely. All right. Well, let's shift on now next. Alex, if you could shift the slide for me to Dr. Carolyn Shepard. And Dr. Shepard is former Senior Vice President for Clinical Affairs at Clinica Family Services. She is a practicing clinician, and she now has a consulting business that she also does, helping other practices transform and change. And I've had the good fortune to hear Carolyn speak at many different conferences, and I always find her right out there on the cutting edge. She speaks truth to power, I think would be the best way to describe kind of the insight that she shares in many of her conferences. So I'm very delighted to have her here. And Carolyn, I wanted to go ahead and ask you the first question that we have about leadership and working with leaders, and then how facilitators in particular can help them. And so my first question for you, from all of your experience, and Clinica really is, to kind of share with the audience, considered an exemplar federally qualified health center across the nation. It's one that, for example, Tom Bodenheimer has done a number of case studies of, trying to figure out how they do what they do so we can spread it. And so you really are hearing from the expert here. And I wanted to hear from you about what advice would you give practice leaders in small and medium-sized primary care practices who are wanting to create a culture of continuous improvement in patient safety?
Thanks, Lindy. I think probably the place to start with this question is to talk a little bit about having practice leaders understand that transforming the way we do care is a very big process, but we often think transformation means fast. And I think in my experience, the successful transitions that people have made are really places where people are at peace with the fact that it takes one small change, one test, one cycle, and implementing that improvement at a time. And we are kind of by breed an impatient group, clinical leaders, and sometimes we want the miracle overnight. And I think my advice to leadership, clinical leadership, is to understand that the hard changes really require time. And this really includes transformation around patient-centeredness and patient safety. So it takes being patient with what is oftentimes a glacial pace because our systems are so complex. The next thing that kind of pops into my mind is around the competency on performing, improving performance, and that is paying attention to not just the planning of innovations and testing of them, but really that twin process that has to happen after a improvement is defined, and that's taking improvements to scale or spread, and then sustaining the change. And this is the job of leadership. There is no way for someone in our practices working on care teams to be responsible for spreading to other care teams innovations that are successful. So we have lots of innovators in our organizations, but we need to have leadership pay attention to scaling up and sustaining changes. So let me talk a little bit more about leadership and safety. Lindy, I think we have to be very proactive about putting safety on our checklist to make it part of our principle-centered leadership aims. It's easy to talk about access and continuity and other important characteristics of primary care, and we often forget the domain of safety. And when I'm thinking about this a little bit, it seems to me there's probably 3 areas that leadership could put on their radar screen and be sure they are addressing. And that is certainly one of the areas where we have the most challenge in ambulatory care is around management of results being either diagnostic testing or laboratory testing. And we have to be sure that we have systems that get these results into our system and get them managed appropriately. Another area that is classic in primary care that we don't address enough is around medication safety. And so I would put that on the list also is an important topic to be addressing in clinical leadership management meetings and on agendas and in process improvement. Looking at things like the ISMP, the Institute for Safe Medication Practices, high alert medications. They divide them into 2 groups. One is for hospital systems or inpatient care, and the other is for ambulatory care. And there are a lot of medications on those lists that we use every day in ambulatory care. And we should be paying attention to what our process is for prescribing these medications, monitoring them, and adjusting those processes. So these are drugs that are just super common. The biggest one that's very vogue now, and we just hear about it on the news all the time, is about monitoring patients who are on opioids, but also other drugs like warfarin and PTU and seizure medications. There are a bunch of medications that are on that list of high alert meds that we should have a systematic way to review how our organizations are monitoring safe medical practices. So certainly results management and medication safety. And then the third area around safety where leadership needs to take the lead and we need to be very proactive is around creating what Tony was talking about, that just culture where we treat each other in a way that allows us to have issues raised, and we are hard on the process and not hard on the person, and we make our style of reaction, one that is inclusive and opens the door and encourages people to bring problems and any kind of safety to the fore so that we can prevent having it happen again. I guess the only other thing I might say about it is the thing that doesn't change is that centrality of the patient and the family we serve. So over the years, I think every important dead-end mistake I have made has come from losing sight of what was probably important for the patient. And if there are ways to continue to put that central as we make decisions around patient safety and leadership, being sure that when a issue comes down to being better either for the organization or for the patient and their family, then we should be looking at taking the path that is best for the patient and family, and that will keep us out of trouble.
I love that, Carolyn. And you had mentioned that yesterday, and that our biggest mistakes are when we've lost, when we've not kept the patient at the center of it and their experience. Let me ask you, to kind of what you were just talking about, I would love for you to tell me a specific story about how maybe one of these safety issues, the results management or the high alert medications, or perhaps this instituting a just culture that supports effective safety and leadership and change. Can you tell me a specific example of maybe how you as a practice leader have implemented that at Clinica or one of the other organizations you've worked with?
Let's see.
I'm putting you a bit on the spot. Yeah.
That's okay. Let me think about this a little bit. I'm sure I could come up with a long list, but let me just get started, and you'll have to cut me off if I start dumping on a lot of stuff. One little example is we have a work group around our warfarin patients, so patients on anticoagulants. There are newer anticoagulants out that don't take a lot of monitoring. Most of our patients who are uninsured can't afford those, and so they are still on warfarin. We have a committee that is looking at how we manage those patients. We see a bunch of our patients who are homeless in groups so that they can drop in anytime they happen to be in the area. And a homeless patient on warfarin is a challenge, to say the least. This group had a patient on the committee, on our steering committee, which was very helpful for us. And at one point she sent me a note that said she wanted to talk to me about a problem she was having. And I said, of course, sure, I'm happy to. And we set a time, Lindy, for maybe a week away. And I spent the entire week trying to guess where we had messed up in taking care of the patient. And it actually turned out when we sat down to talk, the thing that she wanted to talk about was the enormous interface she was having with the practice all the time she was taking her medication. So we were finding ways to get in touch with her and talk to her about her levels being too high or too low, or how to adjust her medication. And we were seeing her, because she was very active and her meds were hard to control, her blood results were hard to control. We saw her very frequently. And then when she graduated from the program, so when she had been on the requisite 6 months that she had to be on the drug and she went off it, there was a sudden and precipitous drop in contact with the organization. And for her, she felt abandoned. And for us, as an organization, we felt successful. So we were doing high fives and chest bumps, feeling like we got the patient through this course of medication, and she didn't have bleeding complications, and weren't we great? And she was wondering, well, are they still interested in me, or do they care about me, or can I still come for pap smears and nobody's calling me? So that handoff or that transition was something we hadn't paid any attention to. We had spent a lot of time thinking about how to keep the patient safe, but we didn't spend any attention to the transition at the end of the course of therapy. So I think it's just an example of having to hear from the patient what's important, I never would have thought that was the problem she was having. I thought she would be glad to be rid of us, and I wasn't even close.
Wow, that's a great example, Carolyn. Let me ask you one more question, and that is really, can you bring all of this back, this story you just told about this patient and her experience and what you learned from that, and then this kind of larger discussion that you had before that, to the practice facilitator? And where do you see a practice facilitator kind of fitting in there, and what would they need to be prepared to do, and how could they have helped you and your practice navigate some of these issues you've raised? If you had a magic wand, for example, what would they be able to do, and how would they help you?
Yeah, I would love to have a magic wand. Can you get me one?
Me too.
Yeah, I've been looking for that for a bit. But I've had the good fortune of working in practices which have had practice facilitation, and I think one of the things that they can bring to us is the ability to keep putting in front of a busy practice and busy leadership the items that are important. So I think continually dishing up to leadership who are deciding where they're going to put their attention and focus, issues around safety. So if the facilitator really keeps in their bag of tricks the list of areas where some focus could really be helpful, that may not be surfacing by itself to practice teams who are obsessed on 1% of patients who have A1Cs that are 7 or less, to be able to suggest looking maybe at medication, high risk, high alert medications, sharing the list with leadership or teams who might be looking for challenges to take on, looking for opportunities to encourage practices to address the handoffs that are around results management, so that abnormal or slightly abnormal mammogram that needs follow-up and the systems in place to be sure that happens. So I think that's really helpful for practice facilitators to have in their bag of tricks a department which is around common safety issues for ambulatory care. I think also they bring a lot of other things in their tools or their bag which are really helpful. And I think, for example, your module on root cause analysis, showing ambulatory care practices, this is not just a hospital tool to use when someone dies, but it's a great tool to use in ambulatory care when things don't go as we wanted them to go, or failure mode effects analysis, or value stream matching, or just process mapping. All of those tools that our practice facilitators are so good at are really helpful to bring those in and add science to the system of process improvement in practices. And by pointing people towards those domains of safety and ambulatory care, they will be really, really important in getting practices to shine some light or focus attention on those issues. Does that make sense?
It does. That's excellent. And I was busily writing away as you were talking. I learned so much on these sessions. It's just I have the best job in the world right now, I have to say. Carolyn, thank you so much for that. And I again want to encourage the audience to submit questions to our speakers, which we'll get to right after our next guest. Carolyn, thank you. Alex, if you could move the slides, please. And I would like to introduce our final speaker today, Christy Boland-Demetz. And Christy has a fascinating job. She trains practice facilitators, both for her organization TransferMed and then also internal facilitators for practices. She's directing and managing the CMMI project for TransferMed. And as a result of this, has worked with more than 100 practices and a very diverse range of practices, large practices, small practices, federally qualified health centers, private practices, practices within integrated health systems. So she has a very broad perspective on leadership and the ways that facilitators can work with leaderships in these organizations. And so, Christy, I want to thank you so much for joining us. And then
Absolutely.
I want to start. Great. And then I want to start with the first question for you. And just given this kind of breadth of exposure you've had to different practice environments and working with facilitators to help those particular practices and the leaders within them, I want you just to share some of your kind of lessons learned and maybe some common patterns or experiences you found kind of regardless of setting that you could share with the audience about how facilitators can help leadership introduce change, quality improvement, and safety in their organizations.
Sure. Hello, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity, Lindy. Yes, great timing. We just convened practice coaches across the 15 communities for this project yesterday here in Kansas City. So we got to hear front and center what the challenges are among the disparate systems that they're in and small practices. And we had to really stop and challenge ourselves to think not just about the work that needs to be done within the project, so the things that are replicable, that are producing outcomes, but how can they affect change across the care team and the practice? So how can they encourage the care teams to be truly engaged and involved in that change rather than just going in and with a plug-and-play type of approach? Early in the project, I have to tell you, we learned a lot about needing to partner with leaders in the practices. So rather than a teach, report, measure kind of approach where we were giving them information, asking them to report back to us, measuring to see if it was working, we worked really hard to understand the competing priorities and really align the work that we were doing with the initiatives and things that they needed to accomplish in their day. This created a great deal of buy-in by leaders who set the tone in the practice and were often either in decision-making roles or influencing decisions. It reinforced what was important to them, not necessarily to us in the project. It was our job to adapt and to figure out how we were going to get there together. But we were helping them to achieve their goals and create better focus for the teams that they were leading. And when the team sees that kind of connectivity across the things they're being asked to do or change, that overarching comprehensive plan really reduces the confusion, helps to build participation and invites their contribution. So a practical example of that is we found ourselves really taking inventory of all of the good work that they were being asked to do, all of the initiatives, be those quality incentives, pay for performance opportunities. Maybe they were just looking for ways to maximize their revenue within their environment. And we really needed to understand all of that and in some cases do a physical crosswalk to understand how this project meshed with the work that they were already doing and where there were differences and being able to acknowledge that. The other concrete thing I will tell you that has made a huge difference in that partnering role, we have a fair bit of data in this project, and so being able to go on site, to have quarterly leadership meetings with folks that are in the practice, to get a glance at that data first, to be able to understand what we're looking at, to ask sometimes some vulnerable questions, and then to be able to together determine how to best engage the team around this information and how to use it to motivate change. Where do we need to drill down further to understand what's truly going on? A bit of that root cause analysis that you referenced earlier. So that's been absolutely key in really enhancing the conversation and as we'll talk about maybe a little bit later, that metaphorically pulling our chair around to their side of the table to look at that data together and to be able to inform our path forward. Does that answer your question, Lindy?
That does, Christy. And I'm wondering, can you tell me a specific story about perhaps how you and some of your facilitators have engaged a leader around some of this improvement work, kind of brought your chair over to their side and then kind of helped them move forward on an improvement, the role you guys played and what you were doing? I'm big into storytelling because I think that really helps kind of bring home these big ideas.
Sure. Yes, just recently, I will tell you with these quarterly leadership meetings, we've been talking about, because we know as we're working on triple aim, not all of those aims equally motivate everyone, depending on their day-to-day job within the practice. And so as we talk about cost savings, and we're still working with many fee-for-service types of environments, we wanted to talk also about revenue opportunities that will position them for value. So this last round, we really took a look at our data and where there were missed opportunities for revenue around things like Medicare wellness visits or the TCM codes, and talked about how they might bring their teams along in those arenas. It was interesting conversation, and we had to think hard as practice coaches about how to frame that conversation. In some cases, it is a revenue motivator, but maybe not for the MA in the practice who's already working hard and maxed out on her workflows. Where there's opportunity for shared savings, we were thinking more from a safety or reducing high-cost care type of approach. So as we looked at their data, if we could see that many of their diagnoses that were driving, for example, ED utilization, were around falls or things that could be connected to falls, we talked heavily about those Medicare wellness visits as an opportunity to be able to do some early screening and to be able to target and allocate resources to patients who needed more support in those areas.
That's a great example. One of the things, Christy, you and I had also talked about, and I think this has come up both with what Tony and Carolyn shared, and that's really this kind of the strength-based approach, or the Tony was talking about appreciative inquiry approach to working with practices and practice leaders. And can you talk a little bit more about that and how you and your coaches are using it, and then how you prepare your coaches to do that?
Sure, I appreciated Tony bringing it up, as you said, and great points in terms of how to start to apply that. As you said, the data is hard to look at sometimes in practices. Folks feel beaten down by it sometimes if they're not achieving what they thought they were achieving, if it doesn't reflect the reality that they felt in their gut. And so, we in healthcare are often geared to look for deficits, to look for the problems, to figure out how we focus our attentions on those and fix those. But to take a step backward as coaches, and we talked about this a bit as we convened our practice coaches from the communities, how do you create that environment where folks are thinking about what they've done well in the past? Where did they feel success? Where did they see success? What were they thinking and feeling in those moments? And if we can recreate those scenarios and help them to pull learnings from that, then to apply those learnings to the next step. So taking forward, as we look at a specific opportunity, what do we do well as a practice? How can we translate those learnings to the changes that we're looking at making now? And then how do we keep that moving forward? And I'll give you an example. We've worked with a practice in the past who has a data wall. And I know a lot of practices have done this. It's a lot of challenges to get to that point in terms of just understanding, what data are we going to focus on as a team? And in this project in particular, there's a lot of data, so creating that focus is important. Maintaining that focus is important. But if we have a role in the practice who can, once we've identified what measures we're going to look at, pull that data on a regular basis, put it up in front of the team. This particular practice not only posted it and referenced it regularly, they huddled around it daily. And so during their daily huddle, the practice manager would put up the new data. They would review it as a team. They would talk about and celebrate where they were seeing successes. They would identify those opportunities, and based on where they had those successes, what were the pieces that got them there that they could apply to those opportunities. The practice coach was integral in that process as the person who listened to those opportunities, listened to the key learnings from the team, and then put on rails what needed to go forward, who needed to be involved in conversations. Does this impact policy, process? What are our next key steps? So that practice coach was seen as a key person, but they were also the one that was asking the questions as the team maybe was starting down that deficit path, starting to ask those powerful questions again about, let's talk about how we improve this mammogram rate. Now, what from that can we bring forward to whatever the measure is that they were looking at that day that maybe didn't do so well? Kept the team spirits up, but also helped them to bring forward learnings from past successes.
That's great, Christy. Thank you so much. And I know you had a slide. Did you want to show that slide, or did you already cover what was on that slide?
Sure, it can be for a reference point. These were kind of 3 key learnings that we felt
Alex,
yeah, thank you, Alex. That we've brought forward, and I mentioned early on that partnership with leaders, and for us, Lindy, I know you mentioned earlier those C-level leaders, the site-level leaders. The site-based leaders is really where we have targeted our efforts to align our approach, knowing that they're leading up and they're leading down, and they have a good sense of the direction and the vision, hopefully. But we have to be aligned with their vision for their care team, and our messaging needs to be clear with the care team as well, so that they see us as a partner in problem solving, and that the team comes along and sees the credibility of it all. The second one, the data changes everything, is the point at which we realized we needed to be on the same side of the table with them. So fostering curiosity and humility around the data to be able to really dig in and finding ways to make it actionable and usable. And then finally, that gaining and maintaining focus. So not just identifying what it is we as a team see as important, where we're looking to improve, where we have opportunities if we do improve as a practice, what's important to our patients, what are they telling us. So making those decisions as a team, this is the key focus for now, knowing we can't forget all of the others, and then maintaining, looking at sustainability. So whether if we have a scorecard that has a small number of measures on it, making sure that we're going back and looking at a more comprehensive view of the data from time to time to make sure that the things that we did improve are not slipping.
Great. Well, Christy, thank you so much for that, and I appreciate so much sharing your experience. You've got such a range of practices you've worked with that it's very helpful to have you share that. I'd like to shift now into the kind of Q&A section of this webinar, and we have some questions that have been submitted to our various speakers. And so I'm going to open up the floor, and I'm going to ask the first question to all 3 of you. So just, feel free to jump in as you have a thought about it. But one of the questions that has been posted is, how do you get a practice leader, a site leader, to understand what a practice facilitator does and how to work with them? Christy or Carolyn or Tony, do any of you all have some advice for this particular person?
This is Carolyn. Lindy, let me just respond. I do think having a practice facilitator come to a practice who has never worked with a coach before needs to have an onboarding process, just like when they onboard new employees. And a lot of the information flow kind of goes the opposite direction. It goes from the practice facilitator about who they are and what they have to offer, and I think stories about how they've engaged with other teams that help a site leader understand what the value this person is now adding to their team. I think it actually kind of needs a formal process where an onboarding kind of strategy, talking to leaders but also teams about what domains a practice facilitator can bring help to move the practice forward.
Excellent. Thank you, Carolyn. Tony or Christy, any thoughts on that or anything you'd add to what Carolyn said?
This is Christy.
Oh, go ahead, Christy. You have more experience with this than I do.
Oh, no, Tony. Just quickly, I would just echo what Carolyn is saying and add that, again, that time to sit across the table beside the leader to understand what the priorities are for that leader, what the dilemmas are for that leader. If you know where they're coming from and what they're looking to achieve and can help to foster ways to move that along down the path. And if they see you as a resource within the practice, they're likely to partner right back with you. So I would just add that to what Carolyn said.
Excellent. Tony?
That's right where I was going to go. It's important to present that information, as Carolyn was saying, and the stories can help people imagine their way into what it would be like to work with this person. But at the same time, in that same clinical parallel, when I walk into the room to meet with a patient in an office visit, I'm not saying, here's all this great stuff about your cholesterol and why we should reduce that. It's like, what's really important to you? What are your goals? And then seeing what aspects of prevention or other kinds of risk reduction or other things make sense to that person in light of their particular goals. So starting with, in that one-on-one conversation, the practice facilitator and the leader, to do some listening, just as Christy was saying, and say, what do you care about? And then here's some things that I do that might be in service of that. What do you think? Just to join right in as a thinking partner, starting with what's keeping them up at night.
Excellent. Okay, so here's another question, and I think this again is for all three of you all, and it says, I greatly appreciate the comment about the time it takes to make changes. How do you manage this when practice leaders are setting a tone of urgency? Carolyn, how would you react to that question? How would you answer that?
Well, I think practice facilitators could help us understand the successes we're actually realizing. I think often we want change, total transformation by tomorrow morning, and we don't really see that actually the way we're managing this process is now better and is aligned in a patient-centered medical home model, and we've made a great improvement on it, even though it just happens to do with how we manage phone calls that come in after 6 p.m. or some small slice of the piece of work that we do. So I think folks who work in other practices have knowledge about how everyone else is doing and can really be, this sounds sort of patronizing, but cheerleaders, helping people understand that the small successes that we achieve are very important in moving towards that more rapid and bigger, broader spread transformation.
Excellent, Carolyn. Tony, how about you? Do you have a reaction to that?
Carolyn, I was so happy when you said that about the time, because I think there are such unrealistic expectations, and then they make everybody anxious because they feel like they're failing because they're not doing it quickly enough, or it's not. It's like everybody's working from a really inappropriate metaphor about what changing an organization is like. They think it's like a machine, and so you unplug one part and you plug a new part in, or you just redesign this part and then it's suddenly supposed to work, or you just unscrew the light bulb and screw a light bulb in. And you know, an organization is a social process. It's people, and those kinds of things change at a very different pace than a machine changes. So recognizing there's a whole social process as well as a technical one, and that takes longer. Another problem in realistic or unrealistic expectations is how many things people are trying to do all at once. I've been in so many organizations where people are overwhelmed by how many different change initiatives they're doing at once. And we just start working on this one, and then suddenly, this is the one that's most important now, and that other one gets dropped and never followed up on. So people get cynical and say, yeah, I'll wait to see if anybody really follows through on this new one before I do anything. So it's like an absence of a strategy. It's an absence of strategic prioritization. So expectations about how long it's going to take and expectations about how many things you can do at once, I think, are really important to help people manage it. Yeah.
And so, Tony, what would the facilitator specifically do around those 2 points? Is it a training process with the practice? How could they help with those 2 issues you raised?
I think it's a matter of reflection, just reflecting back to the leadership what you're seeing, and saying, it's like if you've got 15 things you're trying to hold in your arms, you're going to drop them all. So of course I understand why you want to do all 15 of those at once, but which one or two are most important now. You have to sequence these. Just helping them see how unrealistic, how they're going to get in their own way and succeed at none of them if they try to do all of them. It's just telling them, not judging them. You can say it compassionately with empathy. I understand how important all these things feel. It's just not realistic what's most important. You can even point out the consequences that you're observing in the organization of trying to do all these things at once, how it's actually, that's the way in which they're inadvertently sabotaging what they're trying to do. And you point it out to them and say, what do you want to do about that? It's still their decision. It's still up to them.
Excellent. Christy?
Lindy, this is Christy. Yes, this was one of the challenges that came up as we convened practice coaches here this week. I think as they feel that urgency, there is such a temptation to become more directive in their coaching approach, which is not the best approach, obviously. So understanding that if we really continue to push down that road, and not only do we lose buy-in, but we lose a lot of time on the back end, trying to redo, trying to back up and get input from the team, and an even greater risk is we probably missed some solutions or opportunities that the team could have surfaced had we put the issue in front of them. So it is tough as a practice coach to come into a scenario in a practice and allow them to be part of the problem solving, part of the dialogue, and give the time that it takes for that to evolve, especially when things are moving so quickly. The other thing that we talked about related to this was sometimes it takes breaking down the big change that you're looking at into what all is involved in. I know Carolyn kind of mentioned this. So one of the things that we talked about was bringing in care managers or care coordinators and establishing that role in the practice, and how so often it's the case that funding is realized and so a job description is written and a person is hired, now what? Rather than really thinking through what we've just decided to do. How are we going to build engagement for that across the practice? How are we going to integrate that role into the team? What exactly will they do? And do we have consensus on what it is that we're looking for that role to achieve? What's the outcome that we're looking for? Does everyone see that a little differently? Are we looking for management of high risk and others are looking for reducing high-cost care? Very different approaches, and so we need consensus and need to have the time for those conversations to emerge. So it's challenging to manage time when everything feels urgent, but helping to frame and understand the decisions that are being made.
Excellent. Well, Christy, thank you. And I wish we had a whole lot more time because I would love to get the three of you all talking about many different issues. But we are almost at the end of our session, and so I want to go ahead and transition to the next and close to final part of this webinar, which is sort of a wrap-up and reflection on what was discussed today from Bob McNellis at AHRQ. So Alex, if you could shift the slide, and Bob, if you could take it away.
Thank you, Lindy, and thanks for leading such a wonderful discussion. And before I even start, on behalf of AHRQ and the team at Mathematica, let me just say thank you to Tony Suchman, thank you, Carolyn, thank you, Carolyn Shepard, and Christy Bowling-Demertz. Thank you all very much for participating and for your great insights. I really appreciate it. There is no way I'm going to actually summarize adequately what we've just heard over the last hour or so. But let me highlight a couple of points I think came up that are worth repeating, at least taking home a little bit. And on the slide, I just listed a few potential things. So if we think about the role of practice leaders in promoting culture change, I think we heard quite a lot around that. And one of the first things I heard, and I love this reference, is sort of is this epidemic of reflection, and helping practice leaders can help create this epidemic of reflection within their organizations, to get people thinking about changes that need to be made and how to be actually just mindful and waking up from the trance, as you said, Tony, I think is a really important role for leaders. Also, beginning to recognize this interdependence role, that everything is related, and coordinating all of those relationships. I think there's a lot we can use there. Actually, I look forward to looking up Jody's references on those dimensions of interdependence. I think it's going to be fascinating. The other sort of important point about leaders is helping them recognize that we've heard a couple of discussions about change doesn't mean fast. it's going to have to take some time, and people have to be very deliberate about that. And I think having leaders understand that is important. And then, Carolyn, you pointed out that there's really two things that leaders can do that nobody else can, and that is taking innovations that work up to scale and then helping to sustain those changes. Are really critical role for leaders, as well as sort of understanding the overarching plan to how all these things are going to get done. So those are just a few of the things I noted you mentioned about leaders. In terms of what can practice facilitators do to support practice change, well, there's a whole host of things that are important. We heard about some tools like appreciative inquiry, I think was an important one. Generating that aha moment, which I also love that term. I'm going to use that one, Tony, the aha moment. I love that. To really helping recognize where that moment is, and that drawing attention to how staff are treated really says a lot about how patients are going to be treated and how to work on that culture, the culture change. Other tools about designing meetings and how we do check-ins and calibrations is an important thing that practice facilitators can bring, I think, to the game, as well as the ability to help put in front of leadership. Those things are important, helping them to prioritize. Seems like an important one. Shining the light on the most important issues and bringing science to practice improvement are things that we heard about, I think, that are very, very important. And then thinking even more about what are some of the biggest challenges and opportunities. Well, we've heard many. And a couple that I heard that I think might be helpful to at least highlight is looking at systems. And Carolyn, I think you did a nice job about this, especially when you talk about domains of safety and those three in particular things. That one thing that practice facilitators I think are particularly good at can be teasing apart systems and helping practices understand what those systems look like. A great example there of warfarin and the focus, having a practice focus on patient safety instead of patient-centeredness, and making sure we reflect those things well. But also, as Christy, you point out, being sure that practice facilitators can look through the practice's eyes and be able to tell stories. All important things. Not to mention the preparation, that coaches need preparation to do this. They just can't walk in and do it, but really need to build credibility, have practices understand their value, and whether it's a formal onboarding process or another way. It certainly leads me to sort of this metaphor that we often use, that practice facilitators are the clinicians for the practice. And Tony, your example, I think, highlighted that. And then finally, the challenge of managing expectations and, again, helping set priorities, I think, is going to be a critical one as we move forward. And then the very last point I'll make, which I think is useful to reiterate for all of these, and one that I think, Carolyn, you made so well, and that is constantly remembering for all of us, certainly the practice facilitators as well as the leaders, and that is the centrality of the patient and the family in all the work that we do. And although the revenues are going to be important, as you mentioned, Christy, for sort of maintaining practice's ability to deliver the things that are important to patients, that just remembering why we're in this business is really an important thing. So I think, again, with that, I'm going to stop there and just, again, thank you all to our guests and Lindy for such a great conversation. And Jay, I'll turn it back over to you for the final words.
Great. Thank you, Bob. Next slide, please, Alex. Thanks. And I just want to reiterate Bob's thanks to all the speakers today and for their great insights into working with practice leaders, and point out to you that we have another in our series of these webinars, which will be on January 29th at 3 p.m. Eastern. And the topic of that webinar will be how practice facilitators can support increased patient engagement. And there'll be registration details coming soon about that. For ongoing updates and more information about practice facilitation and about a large number of these issues that we've been talking about today and we've talked about on other webinars, I would encourage you to subscribe to the Practice Facilitation listserv. And you can do that by sending an email to the email address that's listed right there on the slide, and just include subscribe in the subject heading, and you'll start getting those listservs. And also, we have, as Bob mentioned earlier, case studies of exemplar practice facilitation training programs available online. And if you click on this link, you can get the version of those that's available online. And also, there should be access to that in the resources widget for this webinar. Next So that concludes the webcast for today, and I would encourage you to please submit feedback to our presentation team in your browser window when the event concludes. If you're unable to provide your feedback at this time, you can view the on-demand recording of the event and access the survey widget there. And the on-demand recording of the event will be available approximately 1 day after this webcast and can be accessed using the same audience link that was sent to you earlier. And you will be able to review anything that you would like to review from this webinar. Thank you all and have a great day, and we hope to have you on our next webinar in January.